G'day everyone, welcome back to Rule of Reason. And today my guest is the federal member for Macpherson, Leon Rebello. Leon represents one of the fastest growing regions in the country and brings with him a fresh perspective as the youngest voice in the coalition in the federal parliament. Before entering politics, he worked as a solicitor specialising in foreign investment and served as a staffer to former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. In this conversation, I want to explore his vision for Australia and why he believes there is reason to be hopeful about the future, even at a time when many see only challenges ahead. Leon, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, Zach. And welcome to the beautiful Gold Coast.
Well, and why I chose this room, what a beautiful spot for an office. What a great place to live.
Yes.
Absolutely. I thought we might start just for those who maybe have seen your face on TV or social media but don't know who is Leon. Do you want to give us a quick backstory where you grew up, your education, your family, and how or what it was that shaped your desire to now be MP Leon Rebello?
Sure. So I actually grew up in Canberra. I was born in Canberra. I started off at, I went through Catholic education. So I went to St Edmund's College in Canberra, which is a fantastic school, and I think it gave me a sense of the values that I now try to carry out in my day-to-day life. But then I also went into a public school, and I went to Narrabundah College in the ACT as well. So I had the public and the private experience. Mum and Dad migrated to Australia. They came here from India. So a state called Goa, which was a Portuguese colony in India, which is why my surname is Rebello, and we were all raised Catholics. And they moved to Australia a couple of years before I was born. Dad's a tradie, so he's an electrician by trade, and Mum works in the public service, and they're both still working today. And I grew up with, I don't have any siblings, and our family was mostly, as in our extended family, was mostly overseas. In fact, they were just about entirely overseas. But I had the opportunity, I think, to have a very tight-knit family as well, and Mum and Dad made sure that we were all connected, which even now, you see the benefit too. I ended up studying at the ANU. I decided to pursue a law degree, and I did that as a combined degree with international relations, and I specialised in international security. And there was a component as well, I was very interested, and I still am, in linguistics. And so I decided to do some tertiary French education as well. And I had the opportunity to study in France, in the Netherlands, and in China as well. So the course I studied in China was called Major Issues Concerning the Rise of China, which I don't think they'll ever teach again. But
studied that in China?
I studied that in China. It was a formidable opportunity. So it was run through a partnership called the International Alliance of Research Universities, and I was one of two students selected from the ANU to go and be a part of that. And it was run by Peking University in Beijing, which is a very reputable institution, but the lecturer that was running the course was actually from Cornell University in the United States. So it was, at the time, I suspect, China's attempt to say we're open to the world. But it was a great opportunity to deal with head-on some of the issues that we're seeing, take place. And then in France, I had the opportunity to do part of my Year 11, Year 12 studies. And then in the Netherlands, I did a university exchange where I did some of my international law courses. And I also did a course on the role of the Supreme Court in the United States as well. So I had that broad international education experience. And early on in my university years, I managed to pick up a job just part-time and by coincidence in the House of Representatives. And I was pouring water for a lot of the politicians there. And that, to be honest, was my introduction to politics, because I had to sit in the House of Representatives and listen to all of the speeches in, that were occurring at the time, which was the 44th Parliament. So this was when Tony Abbott had just become the Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. And being in that role, you had to be apolitical. And I worked with the Liberal Party, the National Party, the Labor Party. At the time, we had Clive Palmer, the Greens, and you just had to, really focus on the task that you had at hand, which was nothing to do with politics. It was actually the administration of the parliament. I even worked in the basement mailroom. And that 2-year period that I was in that job alongside university, it actually made me, sitting and listening to all the speeches, really understood where I sat politically. And I think it was such a unique opportunity to have that experience so close to the centre of Australian politics and to have that opportunity to really say, actually, hang on, this person said X. I actually really agree with that. And so soon after I finished that, it was the 2016 election, was around the time I finished in that role, and I'd been in the Netherlands, and I think I came back from the Netherlands and then decided, was offered a job to work for a member of the coalition, and that was my introduction to party politics. And I worked for a backbencher from Queensland, Andrew Wallace, the member for Fisher, and that was my introduction to Queensland. And over the years, I was with Andrew for a year and then ended up taking on a role with Julie Bishop, who was the Foreign Minister and the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party. And over that time, I came to Queensland quite a lot, and I realised quite quickly that this was somewhere I wanted to settle. And I finished my university degrees in 2018, which was coincidentally when we had the leadership spill, and Julie, as Foreign Minister, decided to stand aside. And I thought it was a good time for me to, given I was graduating, finish up and go and actually practice law. And I'd done a short clerkship with King & Wood Mallesons, which is a very old Australian international law firm. And then I decided to go and work full-time as a graduate with King & Wood Mallesons and start working your way up through the private sector. So I had some incredible opportunities to work on some quite fascinating matters. I worked on the Bushfire Royal Commission in response to the 2019-2020 bushfires, and a few other corporate M&A matters, and then eventually decided I really wanted to specialise in foreign investment law, so inbound investment into Australia. And during that period, I obviously was out of politics because I was only in politics when I was at uni, and then moved up to Queensland as well and decided to settle on the Gold Coast. And only a couple of years later did we have the announcement of the former member for Macpherson that she was not going to be recontesting, and I decided to put my hand up within the Liberal National Party for pre-selection, and then won the pre-selection, had a very long election, and it was the most contested seat in Queensland with 12 candidates and a very sort of well-funded Climate 200 Teal campaign, but we won the election as well, and here I am.
Yeah. Well, what I can say for anyone who doesn't know, and I followed Leon's, we'll call it your election campaign, but you really started being present in the community years before the election. And that was something that I admired, because a lot of candidates either don't have the capacity to juggle their personal life and their commitment to what they're trying to achieve, knowing that you're not necessarily going to get elected. That's up to the people to decide. But you knew that you had the ability and you had the passion for the people of Macpherson and Australia. And so whenever you had spare time, at least that's what it appeared to me, you were out, you were at Burleigh Heads, you were down at the RSL, you were in the community. And as I've said to lots of people before, and I have my own personal interests in politics, the general public are not stupid, and they can tell when someone's committed, and they can tell when someone's looking for a payday. And I think people knew that you genuinely cared about the people in this area and the people of the country, and that's why you won. So I actually haven't seen you since you won. So again, so that everyone can see, congratulations. It's awesome.
Thank you. And you're absolutely right. Politics is not easy when it's done well. And I often say to people, you can, and as somebody who has been around politicians for some time, you can be a politician who can just get by. And it's maybe not the most difficult job in the world, but when you do it well and you give it everything, it is very difficult. But we all do it for a reason, because we have, and I suspect we'll get to this in due course, but we have ideas that we want to implement or changes we'd like to make, which is the reason we do it.
Mm. Well, I mean, the reason, as I've touched on in my previous episodes in the show, my reason for the podcast is to provide a platform for people like yourself or others who have a story, whether that be their own or a vision, but one of hope, because I naively like to believe, especially when it comes to politicians, that they go into parliament because they want the country to be better. They want to make as much good for as many people as they can. Whether that's true for everyone or not, it's not for me to say, but it's a difficult game, politics, and I don't need to tell you because you do it. But when there's that to and fro across the chamber of, well, they stand for this and we stand for that, and maybe the end goal of what we're trying to achieve is pretty similar. It's just our paths of how we get there are very different.
That's right.
It's a very awkward jostle for how do we find that common place to achieve something that works best for everyone or as many people as possible. How have you found coming in since being elected? From you've witnessed the chamber, you've watched it and you're pouring water and being in the mailroom and listening to speeches. Now you're the person sitting there asking questions, giving your maiden speech. Is it what you thought it would be?
It is what I thought it would be. And I say that as someone who, as you say, has seen Parliament from a whole heap of vantage points. I think there are times where you do pinch yourself and you say, well, I've sat in the chamber for many years listening to people speaking about what is important to them, but this is now my opportunity to contribute. And I said that in my maiden speech as well. And just going back to what you were saying earlier about why people go into politics, I think for me, it was probably for two reasons. One was because I felt that, I'm probably the most, well, actually my parents are probably the most grateful people in this country, in the sense that they always raised me to, be incredibly thankful for the opportunity that Australia gave them when they decided to call Australia home. And part of me deciding to run is because I share that gratitude on their behalf and I want to, contribute to Australia. But part of me as well is because I see the incredible opportunity that we have in this country. Now, as someone who has spent a lot of time overseas and around the world, I know very well that Australia is so lucky. We're so fortunate in terms of our quality of life, in terms of our resources, in terms of our national character, and something that I focus so much on, which is our national spirit. And I think that over the next decade in particular, we're going to go through some testing, challenging times, internationally and regionally and also domestically. And the importance of people in power making the right decisions will determine whether or not we as a country will continue to enjoy this prosperity and build upon it as well. So I think it's part of being grateful, but also part of wanting to make sure we steer the ship in the right direction was the reason I went into politics. So just going back to, the opportunities that Australia has, you look at what's going on around the world at the moment, and Australia is relatively shielded from a lot of that so far. And so do you, Zach. We come from a generation that hasn't really seen the hardship that our predecessors have seen. I keep, in my maiden speech, I spoke to the men and women who fought the world wars and said that, that was the generation that saved the world. And it is very true. And if you contrast that to the experience we've had, we haven't seen a major recession in Australia in my lifetime. We haven't seen, conflict on Australian soil in my lifetime. And I think it's sometimes very easy to be complacent. And as a country, we can't. So having people who are continuing to work towards ensuring that our quality of life continues to grow in the right direction is important.
It's a tough message for young people. I'm a little bit older than you. I'm in my now late 30s, but I would argue anyone that grew up in the 90s and the 2000s, all you knew was prosperity.
That's right.
You just assumed that the stock market went up. You just assumed that things sort of were affordable to you if you had a pretty normal job. Wars happened in other countries, but that's their problem, not ours. And that was the way it was always going to be. So it's very easy for young people to become complacent, but it also helps explain why the older generations, and I'm talking people in their 80s and older who do have memory of really tough times, would look at young people and think they've got no idea how good it is. And you don't need to have experienced those things to have the context. You're fortunate that you've traveled, right? You come from an Indian heritage, which I personally visited India in 2001 in Andhra Pradesh. And even then, and this is sort of as a telecommunications boom is starting in India, there was a lot of really poor people. Life was very tough if you were below the median in that country. Now, it's getting a lot better, but when you've got 1.4 billion people, it is very hard. We only have 26, 27 million people, and we're very rich. So even the poorest of the poor, not saying that anyone in Australia doesn't have it hard, but even the poorest here are better off than most people in the entire world. And having I understand how fortunate I am that I've been able to travel. Not everyone has, but having that context of seeing other countries, even America, even the UK, you can go to those countries now and go, these are great countries, but it's not like Australia. And sometimes, I don't know what your experience is like, but I know my experience. I was in the UK 9 weeks ago. You can't put your finger on it, but you just go, it's lovely here, and I love the history here, and this is where a lot of our country comes from.
Yeah.
But Australia is still better. and not in the way that they're bad and we're better, but just like a home is home, and we are very fortunate to have the country that we have. And I just wish there was a way that young people could grab hold of that and realize, not to say that things aren't hard for young people now compared to what they have been for the last 30 years, but it's still not bad on the grand scheme of things.
I think the challenges have changed, right? And so there are many real struggles that young people are facing, and we'll touch on housing in particular. It's something that a lot of young people speak to me about, and there are different parts of Australia where and there are different suburbs, even within cities, where people's experiences would be very different, and so. But I think ultimately it is that the challenges have changed. And so there is an opportunity to say as a country, okay, we're going to take stock of what needs to be done. But you are right. Sometimes you look at as a whole, as a country, where we are doing well compared to other countries.
But as we've touched on, there are real problems for young people.
That's right.
Being the youngest member of the coalition and one of the youngest people in Parliament, clearly young people are going to look to you and go, well, you're the person that's like me and we want to get ahead and you're the person who can do something about it. But when you listen to the senior leaders on either side, everyone has an opinion, but it's a lot of waffle. And the policies that seem to go forward as stopgaps. But it doesn't seem to go a long way to fixing the problem. Like I'm fortunate that I bought my house 13 years ago. And so I got in sort of just before it got really bad. But for someone now, you couldn't look at the market in Brisbane, for example, or Gold Coast, Sydney, Melbourne, wherever, and see any way that the house prices could come down or your income could increase to a level where it's attainable. So as someone who that's obviously going to be across your table a lot, do you see a way forward? Do you see a solution to the problem that young people can go, well, at least Leon's onto it?
I do see a solution to the problem. It's not going to be fixed overnight, but I do see a long-term solution. I'll just go back to why. So now we're on housing. Why is it actually so important that we actually empower young people to buy a home? And it's important not only, yes, it provides them with a sense of security. Yes, it's a great investment for them financially, especially for their retirement and their future. But it actually provides them with a stake in the economy. And I think it was John Howard who spoke about that quite eloquently. And at a time where, and I've just seen this at the last election, where a lot of people will come up to you at a polling booth and they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, oh, I don't really care who I vote for, just give me a paper, I'll fill it out. There is a real dissatisfaction with politics, and young people feel that regardless of who they vote for, it's actually not going to change their circumstance. And there is this disenfranchisement. And so when you own a stake in the economy through home ownership, yes, you're securing your future, but you're actually interested in what happens at a national level, and you're interested in the economy, because that's going to actually, it's the same as when you get a job. It's the same as when when you start up a family, but in a different sense. You have that investment in Australia, and you buy into part of our national story. And I think that's so critical and important that young people have that opportunity. Going to the solution, right? And, actually before I do that, I say I'm the youngest person in the coalition. Why is that? It's a phrase that the media like to use a lot when they're introducing me. But why is it actually important? It's important because young people, in my experience, feel that they can actually relate to me. And why can they relate to me? Because I share their experiences, and I have shared their experiences. In the last 5 years, I think I'm one of very few members of parliament who has rented, has bought their first home, and is a landlord. So I've seen it from the three different perspectives, and I've seen that relatively recently. I bought my home at the height of COVID. And so I think there is an opportunity there for me to say, hang on, I'm not just talking about policy X or policy Y as a theoretical debate. I'm talking about it through a prism of a lived experience, which is somewhat different, dare I say, to some of my colleagues and colleagues on the other side. And so that takes us to, okay, well, what do I see as the path forward? I think one of the problems we've had in Australia, and it doesn't help that we have a 3-year election cycle at a federal level, but one of the problems is that policy thinking and policy approaches on housing, and also on other subject areas as well, is very much aligned to election cycles. And you can understand that because people feel that they're passionate about issues, and the only way for them to actually do something about it is to be elected. So, it is on this cyclical character. Housing's not it's not a new challenge. It's at a point now where we haven't seen it like this for some time, but it actually demands a generational solution. And we need long-term policy thinking when it comes to how government is going to address housing and make it actually more affordable, because most young people I speak to, they just think we're just doomed. There is no way we can afford to buy our own home. And so there are a few things. We always speak about wanting to deregulate the building sector, and that is important. I mean, we've seen what has happened with the CFMEU over the years, and unfortunately, this government has been a part of supporting that for so long at a federal level. But you look at why is that an issue? It's an issue because that increased regulation, the rules of the CFMEU is actually adding compliance costs, which are translating into adding additional costs for purchase prices for properties. And some of those are in the vicinity of around 30%. You're seeing issues like that with needing to, we do need to deregulate the building industry, and the amount of new construction codes and rules and regulations also contribute to those increased costs and timeframes and delays, which also turns into cost. We also need to increase supply. And, the Labor government's spoken about they've got their $10 billion Housing Australia, infrastructure fund, and it has built no new homes. And what seems to be the solution is that they are instead going and acquiring homes that are already built, which is not actually adding to the housing stock. So we do need to build supply, but the way they're going about it now is not the way that is going to end up with a decent solution.
Can I play devil's advocate before you continue? Yeah. So I've thrown the idea around for a while now when people are very quick to accuse boomers or elderly people to say, oh, well, houses were so much cheaper for you in the 60s, 70s. And they were relative to median income. But the cities were also smaller. So like the house I live in, I'm about 6 or 7 kilometres from the CBD in Brisbane, and it's an expensive house. But I looked it up. The house was built in 1962, and it was farmland when it was built in 1962. So the person who bought it as a new house in an estate in 1962. The problem now is the sprawl of our capital cities are so big that the housing estates, like for example in Brisbane is Springfield Lakes, or in Sydney it might be Campbelltown, Melbourne it might be out past Pakenham. There are these areas where people go, well, I could actually get a house I could afford, but I'm over an hour from the CBD. I don't want to live there. So is there an element of young people, yes, we want to make houses more affordable for you, but there's an element of sacrifice to having the home ownership and being in a capital city just because of the sheer size of our cities now?
There absolutely is. And I'll start by saying that I actually, whenever people get into this us versus boomer debate, I just think it's so incredibly unhelpful. And the reason is because there are so many circumstances. There are things that have been easier for us now. There are things that were easier for the boomer generation previously. And conversely, there were things that were more difficult as well, both ways. So I just think it's almost starting a bit of a class warfare, which we just don't need in Australia. Where we need to put the focus, and this goes to your point, and this is where, I've said, yes, we need to deregulate the building industry. Yes, we need to increase supply. But if we're going to fix housing as a generational issue, we need to actually start building new cities. And I've started having the conversation about this. I spoke about it in my maiden speech. It's not really something that you hear much in political discourse in Australia at the moment. I would very much like to hear more of it. But what does it mean? So Australia, I'll tell you something. So since the Second World War, Australia has only built one new sizable city, and that city is the Gold Coast, where we are right now. We haven't built any other sizable cities. And you compare us on landmass to comparable countries, to other countries, and you look at the United States and how many cities are there. Growing populations are able to be catered for in those cities. Australia has the land, and we do have the land that's habitable as well. I'm not talking about, in the centre of Australia, but around the periphery, there is a lot of land. And I'm not saying we should go out there and start building new cities from scratch like they're doing in the Middle East. But what I am saying is we need to look at cities that are, or towns, right, in the regions that are already there. So we can take places like, and some of them are larger cities like Newcastle, Townsville, Cairns, and then others that are a bit more regional, places like Albury, Wodonga. And we need to look at these and say, well, actually, they're relatively proximate to a major city. They can cater for growth. And they, especially some cities that have the natural environment as well, that will coincide with the lifestyle that people are more so looking for now than perhaps what they were looking for before. And we can say, and I always say, I'm biased in that I think the Gold Coast has the best beaches in the country, but there are also other coastal areas that are incredibly beautiful that you could actually build cities around. And the point of what government, and this is where government should step in now, is they should say, okay, we're identifying these places. Let's start by investing in the infrastructure, because when you've got the infrastructure, it all flows afterwards. So let's put the underground metros. Let's put the heavy rails connecting them to a major city. Let's put the light rails if appropriate. Let's use, work with our state governments, make sure we've got the schools, use the tax system to incentivise businesses to set up shop there and incentivise international companies at times to set up their headquarters there, which if you use the tax system well enough, you could almost achieve anything. Mm-hmm. Let's do all that now so that the conditions are right. Our migration system, and there's a lot of talk about migration. I've been very clear in some of my views on it. But, when Australia has the opportunity, and the federal government does have the opportunity to target where migration goes in Australia, if we want to use it, if we want to use those levers. So we can redirect migration, not all of it, but parts of it, to certain areas. Let's actually use these new cities as an opportunity to contribute to, I guess, this housing, or an opportunity to solve the housing crisis. And what will happen, so you look at the Gold Coast, like right here on the Gold Coast, I've been saying we should be investing in east to west connections because everyone does want to live on the Gold Coast and they want to live down the coastal strip. But we've got some beautiful areas out west. And once you have the infrastructure, developers, councils, state governments, that land can then be unlocked and you can actually have young families who, and I still believe in, where possible, giving people the opportunity to have a backyard. So it's not just apartment living in Australia. And they can actually live 20, 30 minutes from the city and commute in to the city as they need to for work. Keep in mind now we also have a large proportion of the population that works remotely. And actually start solving housing as a generational issue, because Australia's population growth isn't going to end now. And we need to, I think, have that generational solution to it.
Yeah, it really inspired me to think when I listened to your speech and you mentioned the vision for 2100. And I like the idea of going, not only are we going to target, let's say it's Geelong, and we're going to bring car manufacturing back. Newcastle, we're going to do, and you just pick all these cities and you go, what we're going to do is we're going to drop one major manufacturing component that we've got rid of over the years in there to stimulate growth, to stimulate jobs. I'm a big fan of energy policy, not for climate change reasons, but because if you're honest with what the future looks like with AI and robotics, and the country that controls the power controls the world. And when I say power, I mean energy. So it's not green versus coal versus nuclear. We need all of it. We need all of the power. And so if you say, all right, well, Newcastle can be the power hub. We're just going to have storage centres. Newcastle is just going to be a power storage city. And then Geelong's building cars. We're going to put the headquarters of ABC in Wagga Wagga. We're going to, whatever it is, right? And you just drop industries into cities and go, great. It's just going to grow. Right. And again, the tax break is key. We have a very convoluted tax system, but you can make it work for you if you choose to.
You can make it work, and Australia is well overdue for tax reform. We haven't had meaningful tax reform in this country for some time. So I do think there are some opportunities there, and I think if we start the conversation and continue the conversation, we're actually going to be thinking about how we solve generational issues. And housing is something that really needs some work.
So that's something that's somewhat thrust upon you. I mean, you are passionate about it, but it's thrust upon you as a young person in Parliament. What are some of the other things, 1, 2, 3 things you're very passionate about that you would like some opportunity to sort of explain why and your views on it that maybe you don't get given the time to talk about?
Yeah. Look, one of the things I'd say as a young person that I mentioned in my maiden speech, but it is something that it's worth repeating. I am often viewed as a representative of my generation, and I think it's very hard to go past the issue of national debt, because that is something that, my generation and future generations are going to be left with. And I can talk about that for a long time, but I'll leave it there in that I'll say that as a country, it's very easy to, I heard today somewhere about us, the interest on Australia's debt costing us about $50,000 every minute, I think it was, which is insane. And
it's horrifying.
And this is where, as a country, we need to start thinking, how can we be more self-sufficient? A second point I'd make, just which is sort of loosely connected, is I've been very outspoken in saying that Australia should, and Australian governments should, try to invest in domestic manufacturing. And the reason that's important is because we don't ever want to be held ransom by any one country, and we want to have that domestic capability at a time where you see around the world different countries shifting their focus from more of a globalised focus to an internalised focus. Australia, it's part of our security. It should be part of our security strategy that we are able to manage on our own to a certain extent. We're not going to be totally able to do that, but we need to start putting in the conditions now to start being capable of standing on our own 2 feet. So I think those are some of the other things. I'm very interested in, obviously, the foreign affairs side of politics. I'm now the deputy chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I also sit on the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. And at the moment, there is a lot happening in our region, and it will continue to be. I think one of the lessons that I learned when I worked for the former foreign minister was that Australia does have a loud voice, and some people will often think that, I think a lot of Australians think, oh, we're kind of the Switzerland of the South. We're very laid back and casual, and it doesn't matter what Australia thinks or says, other countries will just go ahead and do what they wish. It's not actually true entirely. In my experience, Australia does have a leadership role, especially in the Indo-Pacific, in that when we speak, other countries listen. And why do they listen? Because look at the quality of life we enjoy. And so we do have that soft power focus. And I think there are opportunities for Australia to make the most of that over the coming years. So,
Yeah, it seems to me quite often people go, or people in the media potentially will say, commentators will say, Australia is small compared to America, the UK, Russia, India, powerhouse nations. But they're using the wrong metric. I mean, I think maybe it's cynical to say this, but the world is controlled by economics. And as far as economic countries go, we are a powerhouse. We're in the top 10 wealthiest nations in the world, and per capita must be in the top 2. I don't have but we're right up there, right? So clearly we've done something right. Yes, we are able to lean on our natural resources. We could lean on that even more, which might be a conversation for another time. But we are doing things really well. So I think we do need to take ourselves a bit seriously, because we are coming into 5 or 10 years of we don't really know socially and economically what's going to happen. The UK, there's a little bit of turmoil starting to bubble up over there with things that are happening. There's quite a big divide on the Houses of Parliament over there on views on what people believe. People who support the Labor Party and Keir Starmer really are quite worried of Nigel Farage and his side of Parliament, and the distance between them. Now, distance, as you would know, in Parliament is actually good. You don't want the parties to be exactly the same. Otherwise, why would anyone vote for your party if you're in opposition? Because they don't get anything different. But you don't want such a chasm that the entire country collapses and has to rebuild again every time a new parliament comes in.
I think the lesson in the UK is something that Australia should see as a warning. And France is in the same boat, and there are other European nations in the same boat. The fact that it has gotten to a situation where there is that stark contrast and stark divide, I think is symptomatic of a number of mistakes that were made in the past. And, in the UK, one of the driving factors is it's actually not even economics necessarily. It's social cohesion, which is really fundamentally broken down, and that's often tied to what's happened with migration in that country, and also it's the same thing in France. And this is why at the moment in Australia, I think it's the responsibility of politicians. In fact, I think we have an obligation to make sure that we manage migration in a way where we don't result in a situation like that, because when migration is managed well, it actually works well. And we've always said that we're the most successful multicultural country in the world, and there was a reason for that. It was because of the way our multicultural program was managed. I think the risk of not managing it well, which I will be very honest in saying that I think the current Labor government is doing an absolutely shocking job of, the consequence of that is what we see in the UK, where people feel that it is actually the fault of these migrants who are coming in, as opposed to the fault of bad government policy. And I think it creates that further divide. And so when government's doing its job properly, on the migration front, for instance, you won't see this massive divide that we're seeing in the UK. So I think it is symptomatic of previous mistakes, unfortunately.
I think it would be, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, I think this is one of those moments in our history where the government, whether it's the current government or even just bipartisan in the House, you don't need to necessarily agree on a particular policy when it comes to immigration, but you do need to agree that we need some level of immigration. Perhaps there's too much at the moment. 0 is not enough. And I would urge people who are anti-immigration, who may listen to this or watch, take a moment to understand that the reason we have immigration is to fill roles or gaps within our community that we actually can't fill. The next time, let's say, for example, you go to a doctor and your GP's from India, you're not going to go, oh, well, you're an immigrant, so I'd rather be sick. Like, that's an outrageous thing to say. So we clearly need a level of immigration. I think there's a breakdown of communication from a governmental level, and I'm going to assume it comes from well, we understand the policy, so you should too. And then communicating that policy to the average person who's sitting there going, well, I couldn't buy an entire week's worth of groceries this week. My power bills have gone up by 30%. My kids can't buy a house. There's single mothers that are going without food. Like, things are not so great, and yet you're bringing people in from other countries. Like, shouldn't you help us first? Like, we were Australians first. And so you can see that sort of human self-preservation kicks in. And you go, well, hold on, why aren't you looking after me, but you're looking after them? And I think that's the extreme we're seeing in the UK, right? When you hear the stories of, well, there's immigrants that are being put up in hotels and people go, well, I'm living on the street. And it causes that social divide. And if it was communicated effectively, you might find that all of that would settle down. It's that lack of communication that seems to be causing the problems rather than the actual policy itself. I agree with you. The Labor Party's immigration policy is terrible. But if we were just to look at it holistically from can we at least agree that the immigrants themselves aren't bad? They got given an invitation to come and they came. I would too.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well,
like, you can't blame them for, if someone said, hey, do you want to come live in Australia? And you're like, yes.
Yeah.
I would say yes too. So
no, that's right. The responsibility lies with the government of the day, the ones who have made those policy decisions. I think, Australia was built on migration. It's the migrants, who came to Australia. I said to you, I grew up in the ACT. Most of the housing, the big buildings, they were built by the Greeks, the Italians, the Croatians. And without migration, Australia wouldn't be anywhere near what it is today. And so the amount of people that come up to me, and you're right, because there are Australians, and there are a lot of Australians, including here in my electorate, who are really struggling when it comes to finances at the moment, or they're struggling to, put food on the table, or they're struggling to, afford the things that we'd previously considered to be quite normal. And they will, turn to immigration as the problem, in part. And I do have people who come up to me every now and then and say we need to stop migration 100%. And I just say, well, I look at in Macpherson, the amount of small businesses, the amount of pubs and clubs and restaurants and hotels that rely on migration to actually operate would not share the same views. So it's about getting that balance right. It's about making sure the number that's coming in is appropriate, but it's also doing a disservice to not only our community, but to the migrants themselves if we're bringing people into Australia without the infrastructure for them, and without the housing for them, and without, giving them what they need to contribute and thrive and be a part of Australian society. And I think for some time, and I would like to see this changed, we've had this view in Australia where you go through a process to become an Australian. You have your citizenship ceremony, great, all done, you're now an Australian. I think there actually needs to be a three-step process. There's the before, there's the become a citizen, and there's the after. And the after is, I think, where government has actually neglected that, and that is making sure that we do have the infrastructure, making sure we've got the services in place that can actually assist migrants with, being a part of Australian society. I think that's very important. And what we're seeing now on all those fronts is where government has not been able to cater for example, back to housing. What are they trying to do? They're coming to Australians to say, oh, we're actually going to use you to actually and use your money to compensate for our mistakes. And I don't know if you heard the stuff about the spare bedroom tax and stuff.
I did, and I couldn't believe it was even considered.
But that's a classic example of government saying, well, our infrastructure failings are one thing, but in order for us to compensate for that, we're going to actually dip into the average member of the public who happens to have a 3 or 4 bedroom house and has a spare room because they're either saving it for, a future child, they're saving it for when their grandkids come to visit, and they're actually saying, well, we're actually going to tax you on that. And people I've spoken about this in the past, and people have said, well, the government hasn't actually said that they're going to introduce that tax. It was actually, the background is that when they had that economics roundtable, it was floated as a potential solution to the housing crisis. And the government, however, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer haven't actually been able to rule it out. Now, from my perspective, if I was asked about, can you rule out taxing people on their spare bedrooms? I'd say, well, of course I can rule that out. So the fact that they haven't been able to actually rule it out is enough said, So I think it's shocking.
Yes, silence on the matter is almost worse than just saying yes or no, really. Yeah. It's like, guys, you're making people think you're incompetent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is worrying. It is worrying the amount of things that are piling up, and no government is perfect, but it is alarming the amount of things that are piling up. And when you ask a question, a very straightforward question, yes or no, there's no answer, and you just think, well, I'm running out of things I can actually ask you about that where you can actually answer. So who's actually running this country? It is concerning. I did hear this morning Jim Chalmers talking about because they had the readjusted deficit figures, and he said, we can now start bringing taxes down. But all that said to me was, yeah, that means you've been putting taxes up. But before the election, you said you weren't going to adjust the taxes, and if anything, you're going to bring them down. So who's actually paid for that to come down? It's the people, not you. And I understand, and it's sort of been an undertone of what we've been talking about. In order for Australia to succeed to a level that future generations can enjoy, there will be an element of sacrifice. There will be a little bit of pain moving forward, whether that's through taxation or otherwise. And young people need to understand that we all need to bear that weight to make our country be better than it is now, which is already great. But as I said at the start, Australians are not stupid. And I urge politicians, especially the government, but I urge politicians to heed that warning, because Australians are not dumb and they will see through your lies. And if you tax people saying this is to make Australia better, I know it'll hurt, but trust the vision. But then you allow multinational corporations to pay no tax or very little tax. And you go, but that's, complicated tax stuff, so don't worry about that. People are going to go, well, mate, it's not a level playing field here. Like we all contribute or we don't contribute.
Right. And I've always said the Liberal Party and the Liberal National Party as well, we're the party of small and family business. We're not the party of big business. So, when it comes to contribution to tax, everybody should have a responsibility proportionate. So I think, there is a time now where, as you say, short-term sacrifices for long-term gain may be appropriate. But I think it's interesting sitting in Parliament now and seeing what that's actually playing out to be.
Yeah. I think communication is going to be key moving forward for any member of Parliament. Is make sure whatever you're passionate about, whatever you're talking about, that you're communicating it not in a Canberra bubble way, in a way that mum, dad, and the average person can understand and go, oh, you mean that? Okay, I can see that. Because if you just do Canberra speak, people will just go, what are you doing?
When we're talking about tax, there's this constant, obsession with, okay, if the government needs money because the country needs to pay for the debt that we're in, let's just put taxes up. Now, that's not the way to do it. Tax is one form, it's one lever of government revenue. There's no doubt about it. And this goes to, I was saying for housing, we need to build new cities, long-term strategy. We need to start thinking about how we generate wealth in Australia over the long run. Now, governments don't generate wealth. Businesses do. When we look around, I look at the Gold Coast and the amount of entrepreneurs, the amount of innovators, the amount of, in particular, young people that are setting up businesses. We have some of the most incredible tech startups here in Macpherson. We have people developing all these new and insane apps that are, taking off around the world. We, as government, should be supporting those because we know that is, they will pay tax at some point and they will generate wealth. That's how you generate wealth and grow the economy. So you're not just trying to tax the hell out of everybody to compensate for government. And what I'm seeing in Macpherson, and this is something I'm seeing around the country, is that a lot of people who are going down this path of innovating and creating new businesses, they're actually saying that the tax conditions in Australia are making it so difficult. It's not just tax, it's regulation as well. They're making it so difficult to get their businesses off the ground that they are actually better just going overseas. And we're seeing this brain drain, which I've previously described as a quiet exodus of ambition, and it's all going overseas because it's just becoming too difficult to do business in Australia. I saw this.
Tragic.
I saw this as a foreign investment lawyer. Australia is a very attractive place to invest. The film industry is a really good example, right? I was in LA a couple of years ago and met with some people over there. They love investing in Australia for films. We have some great movies that have been filmed even here on the Gold Coast very recently. And Americans love it here because we have the best natural environment. We have a familiar language, and they love working with Australians because who wouldn't love working with Australians? But they will only do it if it's financially viable. And so making sure that our tax settings for, in that particular example, the film industry, are still competitive will actually keep them filming new movies here in Australia. And what that does is it creates local jobs. It also adds money to our economy. So, and it's, that's an example in the film industry, but we need to take that across, we need to extrapolate it across all industries to say, how can we actually keep our talent in Australia? Because that's how we generate wealth. When we're investing in domestic manufacturing, that's going to help as well. So we need to have that long-term approach. And if there's one thing I can do in Parliament, it's make a bit of noise about saying, hang on, we're not going to be fighting for, policy that is going to be election cycle to election cycle. We need to have that long-term approach.
So the people, I agree, 100%. Yes, it is that challenge with 3 years being the cycle. It is not much time to get things done. And if you're the kind of person that's really looking to implement policy to just get re-elected, it's not enough substance to see generational change. So thank you for that. I do appreciate you saying that. For the people of Macpherson, you are their representative. So yes, we've been talking about sort of a more national view. What sort of things can they expect from you that you're in Canberra championing for them?
In my first week as the federal member for Macpherson in Canberra, when I went down for my first sitting week, I actually went and saw two people. I went and saw Susan Lee, who's the leader of the Liberal Party and the leader of the opposition. And I saw her too. I actually took John Warren, who's the CEO of Experience Gold Coast, and I went to see Susan because I wanted to communicate 2 points. One is that I don't think the rest of the country necessarily understands how fast the Gold Coast is growing, and we need the infrastructure to cater with that growing population. And two was in relation to some specific investments that I think are needed on the Gold Coast. So the extension of the heavy rail down to the Gold Coast Airport from Varsity Lakes is one.
I heard they cancelled that.
No, so that was the light rail. So that's separate.
Oh, this is different.
I'm talking about the heavy rail. So the heavy rail it currently ends at Varsity Lakes. So it goes from Brisbane.
From Brisbane down. Yes, sorry. I apologise.
I think that should go down to the Gold Coast Airport, and you connect airport to airport. There's so many benefits along that, and I can have another podcast on that. And the second one was in relation to Exit 82 in Rebello, which is again very specific to the Macpherson electorate, but it's right in front of the Rebello town centre, which is a very busy shopping centre, and you have a number of major schools in that area, and it's just bottleneck traffic.
Yes, I drove through that to come to this interview today.
Yes, so because of some of the roundabouts there, so we're wanting to make some changes to that. And so I put those both on the agenda for Susan, and I actually decided to the Labor Minister for Infrastructure, Catherine King, sent out an email saying she's got her office open if anyone wants to go in. And I don't know if that was intended to come to everybody, but I thought, well, I'm now the federal member for Macpherson, I'll just walk in. So I walked in and I said, hi, I'm the new Liberal National Party member. I just wanted to communicate, and I said the exact same 2 points that I made to Susan, just to put on the radar the infrastructure needs. So the Southern Gold Coast can expect, and they should expect, that I will continue to be in Canberra advocating on both sides of Parliament for the infrastructure we need, because that's going to set us up for managing this population growth. This is the long-term forward thinking that I'm talking about, that we should be doing at a national level as well. The other thing as well that I would like to see, and it's something that I've already started doing locally, but it is going to be extrapolated across the country as well, is engaging our young people a bit better. Now, what do I mean by that? So in this room, I actually had a number of the schools that I have in Macpherson, their school captains come in, and we did a bit of a morning tea, which I turned into a civics class.
Great.
And it just gave them a bit of an insight into what an MP does, what the differences are between the state, the council, and the federal responsibilities, and just gave them that opportunity to ask questions and to get a bit more engaged about our voting system and why it's important. And it's not a party politics thing. We have a fantastic system in Australia. We need to, you guys need to be actively involved in it. So
they are legally required to vote, therefore they should be educated on how to.
Exactly. And so I'm doing my best to work with, the schools in my electorate, and I have quite a few. I think the last count was about 38. So I try and get to those schools as much as I can. I've also, we're in the process of arranging mock parliaments. So where I've got a mace that the Speaker of the House gave me.
Yeah.
And we take it into the schools and we can run little mock parliaments. So that's just something from a cultural, societal perspective as well, to complement what I was saying at an infrastructure level. And then housing is going to be the big thing on the Gold Coast, but that ties into the infrastructure point, getting the east to west links for rail, and also getting that heavy rail down south, which is going to be key. The Gold Coast is going to be the home of the 2032 Olympics in part, and some of that will be in this electorate as well. So it's making sure that we are ready for it. And what does that mean? It means making sure we have the legacy infrastructure that's going to be able to manage the Olympics, but also beyond. And that's another focus, to try and get as much of that federal funding spent on projects that are going to benefit people here on the Southern Gold Coast.
I think that all sounds like the future is quite bright, both here in Macpherson, but also nationally. The wonderful thing for Queensland, as a Queenslander myself, the Olympics is an opportunity for the government to sell major infrastructure improvements. Big spending on infrastructure is sometimes hard for the population to swallow, but if ever you're going to try and get it across the line, I would argue now is a really good time to do it. And I hope the state government can help as well as the national government. I like to finish every episode with a very open question of, with everything that you know and everything you're trying to achieve, what is making you hopeful for the future?
To be honest, I think it's a combination of a few things, but I'd start with saying our young people. I think we have, without wanting to offend anybody, I'd say we do have among the smartest generation coming through now, because young Australians are taught to think about things critically. They have more opportunities, easier access to information and technology. And so I think there's a great opportunity for us as a country. I think there is also, and this goes above just our young people, something that I'm really working hard to reignite, but something that I think is still there, and that is our national spirit. We spoke about the Olympics just now. I was a kid when we had the 2000 Olympics. And I remember a time in the lead up to that Olympics where we were as united as we've ever been as a country. Everyone was so proud to be Australian, and we were so ready to be on the world stage. And I think we were focused on the future. We used to call ourselves a young country, which you don't really hear anymore, even though it was only 20-something years ago. We used to talk about ourselves as, being the land of opportunity, and Australia, we had a new millennium, and everyone was just so excited. And that sense of pride that we had as a country, if we can get that back, and I think we do have that still, which is why, I'm optimistic, that leads to everything else. I spent some time with the Navy in WA last week, and I was speaking to some of the young people who are serving this country. And one of the things I thought was, we are conscious that we're going to go through some potentially challenging times from a regional and international perspective. But if we instill that sense of pride, if we reinvigorate that sense of pride in the country, you're going to have a generation that not only is prepared to defend it, but understands why this country is worth defending. And I think having when I speak to young people now, I am starting to see that sense of national pride of our character is very much present, and that really excites me.
What a wonderful view of the future. If we could have a government that instilled that into the future generations, I think we'll be okay. Leon Rebello, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.